This story was requested by a loyal porch pal, Sam. Hope you enjoy it. Hawaii is a place of unmatched beauty. Towering volcanoes, cascading waterfalls, and beaches that shimmer like gold under the Pacific sun. But under the surface, beneath the lush green and warm breeze, there's something stranger. A mystery whispered about in hushed tones. A people said to be older than history. A race of master builders, smaller than men, who worked only at night and vanished before sunrise. They're called the Menahooni, and for centuries, Native Hawaiians have told stories about these elusive beings. Some say they built the fish ponds, temples, and roads that predate known Hawaiian history. Others claim they still roam the forests of Kauai, watching from the shadows. And to this day, their handiwork remains massive, precise, and impossible to explain. So, who were the Menahooni? Were they real? A metaphor? A memory of a lost people? Or could something truly unexplainable be hiding deep in Hawaii's mist-covered valleys? Before we get into the story, I'm Devin, and this is Porch Lore. Please be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and help me reach 1,000 subscribers. Enjoy the story. This is Porch Lore. And I'm your host, Devin. This is the tale of the Menahooni. Let's begin where all good mysteries start, before recorded time. Long before Captain Cook rediscovered Hawaii in 1778, the islands were populated by native Hawaiians, who had arrived by canoe, navigating thousands of miles from the Marquesas Islands and Tahiti. But here's where things get strange. According to native Hawaiian oral tradition, when those Polynesian settlers arrived, the islands weren't empty. In fact, the mountains and the forests were said to be inhabited by a small race of people, clever, secretive, and incredibly skilled. These people were called the Menahooni. They didn't interact with the newcomers. They stayed hidden. They worked only at night, and by sunrise, they were gone. But what they left behind still baffles us today. The Menahooni are described in hundreds of traditional stories passed down through Hawaiian families and royal genealogies. They're typically portrayed as between 2 and 3 feet tall, stocky and muscular, often with reddish skin, wearing loincloths or feathered cloaks, living deep in the forests, valleys, or volcanic caves. And most importantly, they are master craftsmen. They could build temples, roads, fish ponds, and walls in a single night. But if the work wasn't done by sunrise, they'd abandon it. Some legends even say they'd destroy the unfinished structure so no one could see their imperfect work. These stories aren't just scattered myths, they're consistent across the islands, especially on Kauai, the oldest of the Hawaiian islands and the one with the most Menahooni structures. Just outside the town of Lihue, on Kauai, there's a site that baffles historians and locals alike. It's called the Elekoko Fish Pond, also known as Menahooni Fish Pond. This isn't a tiny pond. It's an enormous, stone-walled aquacultural system over 900 feet long and perfectly aligned to trap and raise fish using tidal movements. And here's the kicker. According to the local lore, it was built in one night by the Menahooni. Now, the fish pond is real. You can visit it. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. And here's what baffles archaeologists. It predates known Hawaiian engineering techniques. The stones used don't match local rock formations. And oral tradition is unanimous. The Menahooni built it. So were they legends? Or were they the island's original engineers? Across Kauai and other islands, you'll find dozens of ancient structures with no clear origin. stone terraces deep in jungle-covered valleys, hidden water channels lined with volcanic rock, entire irrigation systems built with mathematical precision. And curiously, some of these structures were discovered long before Western contact, meaning early Hawaiians already considered them ancient by the 1700s. In fact, early Hawaiian genealogy chants called mele list multiple waves of migration, and some chants include references to pre-Polynesian people who fled to the mountains when newer settlers arrived. Who were these people? Could the Menahooni be a folk memory of this older race? Or is there another explanation? Here's where things get even more interesting. King Kauai, the last independent king of Kauai, ordered a census of the island's inhabitants. This wasn't a Western effort. It was a Hawaiian census, recorded by Hawaiian chiefs. And on that list, 65 individuals were identified, not as commoners, but as Menahooni. Not mythical beings, living people. Some scholars believe these were descendants of a marginalized group, possibly a different ethnic stock, who lived in the mountains and were referred to by the Menahooni. Others believe it was a clerical mistake. But that doesn't explain the dozens of similar references in missionary journals, traveler logs, and early Hawaiian chants. To many native Hawaiians, the Menahooni were real, not as fairies or spirits, but as a hidden race displaced by history. Unlike European fairies or gnomes, the Menahooni aren't just tricksters or tiny forest sprites. They represent a deeply embedded cultural archetype. To native Hawaiians, the Menahooni reflect respect to the forest and the mountains, the Menahooni's home. Reverence for craft and perfection. They never left work unfinished. Humility before forces older than ourselves. In this way, they may serve a dual purpose, literally as memory of a forgotten people, and symbolically as a guardian archetype, reminding humans to respect the land. And yet every so often, they cross from story into sighting. From the early 1800s all the way to the 21st century, people in Hawaii have claimed they didn't just hear about the Menahooni, they see them. In the 1820s, Christian missionaries began arriving in Hawaii, determined to convert the native population. These missionaries kept journals, detailed records of their experiences, customs, and local beliefs. And one name came up again and again: Menahooni. Most missionaries dismissed the stories as folklore, but not all. In 1822, a reverend named William Ellis recorded native Hawaiians warning him not to go into certain forested areas at night because the little people would be watching. In another case, a converted Hawaiian elder reportedly told a missionary that his own grandfather had seen the Menahooni as a child. Small figures darting through the trees, carrying stone tools, and vanishing before sunrise. Missionaries assumed these were pagan legends meant to be erased. But the locals knew better. They weren't talking about spirits. They were talking about neighbors. Fast forward to the late 1800s, Hawaii's economy was booming with the rise of sugar plantations. And with this boom came laborers from China, Japan, Portugal, and the Philippines. Many were assigned to plantations on Kauai, the island with the deepest Menahooni roots. And strange things started happening. Night watchmen reported hearing footsteps in the dark. Too light for an adult, but too heavy for a child. Others described tools disappearing only to be found later in precise arrangements near ancient stone walls. In one plantation near Wailuai, a Filipino worker told his overseer that he saw a group of tiny men in loincloths moving silently through the sugarcane, carrying baskets of stones. He said they looked like they were building something. When other workers checked the area the next day, they found a small stone wall, partially constructed where nothing had been the day before. The manager dismissed it as a prank, but the workers, they refused to return to that field after dark. One of the most famous modern accounts comes from the Waimea Valley, also on Kauai. In 1940, a school teacher named Hilda Connolly took her elementary class on a field trip through the valley. As they passed a secluded stream, she noticed several of her students whispering and pointing. They said they'd seen a group of small people crouching behind the rocks, watching them. Hilda brushed it off as imagination, but later she mentioned it to a local elder who had lived in the valley all his life, and he told her something that gave her chills. That very stream, he said, was one of the places the Menahooni were said to bathe at twilight, and most locals avoided the area altogether. He told her to take the kids home and not go back after sunset, and she never did. Here's the strange part. From 1820 to the present day, reports of Menahooni encounters have stayed remarkably consistent. The beings are 2 to 3 feet tall. They work or travel in groups. They avoid humans and vanish if spotted. They're usually seen near stone structures or in remote forest areas. They're often associated with construction, tools, or sudden changes to the landscape. It's as if the legend hasn't evolved with pop culture, the way Bigfoot or UFO stories have. The details haven't drifted, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Either the story is incredibly stable folklore, or it's based on real, ongoing encounters. One of the strangest features of the Menahooni mystery is its geographic concentration. The overwhelming majority of structures, stories, and sightings come from Kauai. Not Oahu, not Maui, not the Big Island. So why Kauai? Historians point to several reasons. 1, it's the oldest island geologically, meaning earliest civilizations may have landed there first. 2, it resisted colonization longer. King Kauai didn't surrender to Kamehameha until the 1800s. 3, it has dense interior forests and mountains where isolated communities could survive undetected. 4, and most importantly, Kauai's oral traditions have been preserved with fewer interruptions. Some locals believe Kauai was the Menahooni's original homeland, and when the rest of Hawaii changed, they simply withdrew deeper into the valleys. To this day, there are areas of Kauai that locals avoid at night, not out of fear, but out of respect. They say you don't look for the Menahooni. If they want you to see them, they'll let you know. It's important to note that much of Hawaii's native belief system was erased or rewritten after missionary contact. The early 1800s brought Christianity, Western schooling, and colonial law. And with them came a campaign to stamp out pagan beliefs, including the old stories of gods, spirits, and mythical beings. Some historians believe the Menahooni legend shrunk over time. They may have once been seen as a full-fledged race of people, not magical, just different, marginalized, possibly driven into hiding. They were reduced to fairy tale status. Tiny people, cute, builders, harmless legends. But the older chants tell a different story. They describe the Menahooni as real, flesh and blood, skilled and secretive. A people forgotten, but not gone. Some anthropologists argue that the Menahooni were a metaphor, perhaps used by chiefs to explain old ruins whose builders had been lost to history. Others believe the Menahooni were an actual race or ethnic group, possibly smaller in stature, who were displaced by larger, later arriving Polynesian clans. But then there's a third possibility, the one whispered about by elders and hinted at in ancient chants, that the Menahooni are not human in the way we understand. They belong to an older realm, one that crosses between the physical and the spiritual, one that emerges when the veil between worlds thins. Usually at twilight, near stone, in the forest, and once seen, they vanish. We saw how missionaries, plantation workers, and even school children claimed to glimpse small humanoid figures working at night in remote areas. We've explored how colonialism may have tried to shrink the legend into a harmless fairy tale. But here's the question that really matters. Who, if anyone, were the Menahooni really? Were they myth? Were they metaphor? Or were they something that history, and maybe science, chose to forget? Because when you dig deeper into this legend, things start to look familiar. Not just in Hawaii, but all over the world. Theory 1. One of the most widely accepted theories among anthropologists is that the Menahooni were real people, and not a race of magical beings. Instead, they were thought to be early Polynesian settlers of smaller physical stature due to genetics or diet, possibly from the Marquesas Islands, driven into the mountains by a larger, later arriving wave of settlers from Tahiti, and remembered in folklore as the small ones who live apart. In this theory, the Menahooni weren't supernatural. They were dispossessed. They might have spoken a different dialect, practiced different customs, or resisted assimilation. So the more dominant groups, the ones who eventually shaped Hawaiian royalty and recorded the genealogies, branded them as Menahooni, a word some linguists say may derive from Menehune, meaning lowly or of little status in Tahitian. In other words, a term for outcasts. But the story doesn't end there, because when you zoom out, you realize this pattern has happened before. All around the world, indigenous cultures have legends of small, secretive beings who live in the wilderness, build impressive structures, and vanish if approached. Let's look at just a few. First, the Ebugogo of Indonesia. In the jungles of Flores Island, locals tell stories of the Ebugogo, small, hairy people who lived in caves, stole food, and spoke in murmurs. Sounds like folklore, right? Well, in 2003, archaeologists discovered the remains of a new hominin species, Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the Hobbit. They stood about 3 feet tall, lived around 50,000 years ago, and shared the island with modern humans. Suddenly, the myth of the Ebugogo looked a lot more like a memory. Next up, the leprechauns of Ireland. Though modern media has turned them into serial mascots, traditional Irish leprechauns were described as mischievous, reclusive craftsmen, cobblers, builders, and tricksters who lived apart from society. They were believed to be the remnants of an older race, the Tuat de Danann, who retreated underground after being defeated by later settlers. Then we have the Duende of the Philippines. Small forest sprites known as duende are said to live in anthills and tree roots. They can be kind or cruel, and they're known to be blamed for strange illnesses or unexpected blessings. These beings are often described as 2 to 3 feet tall, wearing old-fashioned clothing, and are extremely territorial. Then we have the Patu Parihi of New Zealand. The Maori people of New Zealand speak of them as pale-skinned, forest-dwelling beings who avoid sunlight and build structures with supernatural skill. They were said to live on mountaintops and appear only in the mist. Sound familiar? A pattern emerges in every case. A small, older group coexists with a larger, newer population. They're remembered as builders, craftsmen, or spiritual guides. They retreat into wilderness or mountains. Over time, they turn into mythology. And then finally, they're forgotten. Which raises a haunting question. What if the Menahooni legend is just one piece of a global pattern? What if every time a dominant culture rises, the older one is forced underground? Not just physically, but culturally. Another theory is island dwarfism. But in humans? There's a biological concept known as island dwarfism. It happens when a species isolated on an island with limited resources evolves to be smaller over generations. This has been observed in elephants, hippos, and even ancient deer. But could it happen to humans? Well, yes. That's exactly what archaeologists believe happened to Homo floresiensis. So it's not impossible that a population of early Polynesians, or even pre-Polynesians, became physically smaller due to limited food supply, genetic bottlenecks, and cultural isolation. If this happened in the remote mountains of Kauai, it might explain both the stature and the stealth of the Menehune stories. But here's the problem. No skeletal remains of such a people have ever been found in Hawaii. None that have been confirmed, none that have been studied, and some believe it's because none of them were allowed to be. Native Hawaiian burials were often intentional and secretive, especially among outcast groups. It's possible that any physical remains of the Menahooni decomposed in the humid jungle or were deliberately hidden to prevent desecration. And there's another wrinkle. When the U.S. annexed Hawaii in 1898, and especially after statehood in 1959, archaeological priorities shifted. Sites associated with Native Hawaiian royalty, temples, and chiefs were studied and protected. But obscure structures in remote areas, especially those tied to mythical beings, were ignored, dismissed, or destroyed during development. In other words, we may have already buried the evidence. In the early 2000s, a small group of researchers proposed a study that could have changed everything. The idea was simple. Gather DNA samples from families on Kauai with strong oral traditions claiming Menahooni ancestry. Compare those samples to modern Polynesian genomes. Look for genetic anomalies, markers of an isolated or ancient lineage. But the study never happened. Why? Partially because of ethical concerns. Partially because of funding. And partly, some say, because of cultural resistance. Many Native Hawaiians were weary of outsiders using science to debunk or steal their legends. And who could blame them? Their history has already been rewritten once. Why hand it over again? Okay, now we enter the speculative zone. Some modern researchers, especially in the paranormal community, have suggested the Menahooni aren't just lost people, but interdimensional beings. Here's the idea. They appear only at certain times. They work or travel only at night. They often vanish without a trace. And people describe a feeling of being watched, but not threatened. These characteristics show up in other little people legends worldwide, and often overlap with UFO and cryptid phenomena. Could the Menahooni just be slipping between dimensions? Phasing in and out of our reality? It sounds wild, but to some, it's no stranger than believing they built massive agricultural systems in one single night. And remember, to the ancient Hawaiians, the physical and the spiritual realms were never separate. The Menahooni didn't live outside of nature. They lived within its deepest layers. And there's one more possibility, the most uncomfortable one. Maybe the Menahooni were real. Maybe we did have evidence. And maybe we, as a modern society, chose to erase them. Because their existence complicates our timeline. It suggests history isn't a straight line. It reminds us that cultures rise and others vanish beneath them. And it challenges the idea that only what's written down matters. We've followed the Menahooni from prehistory to modern sightings. We've explored their possible origins as a displaced people, their eerie parallels with the little people myths around the world, and the theories suggesting their erasure from historical records wasn't an accident, but a deliberate act of cultural amnesia. But the real question that haunts this ancient mystery: what if they never left? because despite centuries of suppression, ridicule, and skepticism, the legend of the Menahooni refuses to die. If anything, it's growing. And the deeper you go, the more it starts to feel like the story isn't just about a hidden race. It's about us. Hawaii is one of the most spiritually alive places on Earth. The land breathes with energy. The mountains, the oceans, the forests, they're not just backdrops. They're beings in their own right. To Native Hawaiians, the Menahooni are not mythical creatures. They're kupua, entities that exist in the liminal space between the natural and the supernatural. They are alive in chants, in dreams, and in whispered warnings about where not to go after sunset. And they're remembered, not just for what they did, but how they did it. Perfectly, quietly, without thanks, and always before dawn. Believe it or not, reports of Menehune encounters continue to this day. In 2003, at Koki State Park in Kauai, 2 campers claimed they were followed by small, shadowy figures during the night. They reported hearing whispered chants and the sound of stones tapping, but saw nothing until morning. In the clearing where they'd been, a perfect circle of small lava rocks had been placed around their tent, and they hadn't made it. In 2011, in the Wailua River Valley, a hiker stumbled upon what she thought was a child alone in the forest, crouching by a pool, covered in red dirt and completely silent. When she called out, the figure looked at her, then darted into the jungle. Authorities found no tracks, despite soft earth. In 2019, at the Lihu construction site, a road project unearthed a set of stones in perfect alignment, part of a structure no one could identify. Workers reported strange malfunctions with their equipment and multiple delays. One local elder told them they had disturbed a Menahooni path. The next day, the crew brought a traditional Hawaiian priest to perform a blessing ceremony, and the disturbances stopped. Here's what makes the Menahooni so unique among folklore figures. They're not demons. They're not monsters. They don't seek worship or sacrifice or power. But they do have rules. According to elders and practitioners of Hawaiian spirituality, if you encounter a Menahooni, do not approach. Do not take photos. Do not interfere with their work. Do not speak their name loudly in sacred places. And above all, show respect. Because in Hawaiian culture, mana, or spiritual energy, flows through every rock, tree, and stream. The Menahooni are not just inhabitants of that system. They are the guardians of it. There's another way to look at the Menahooni, one that's less mystical, but no less powerful. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who coined the term synchronicity, believed that all cultures contain archetypes, universal figures, and ideas that live in the collective unconscious. These archetypes were the hero, the trickster, and the hidden guide. In this framework, the Menahooni are a type of shadow archetype, representing forgotten knowledge, ancestral skill, and the parts of ourselves we've buried. They're not just builders of fish ponds, they're builders of identity. And when modern Hawaiians remember them, not as fairy tales, but as ancestors, they're reclaiming something deeper than history. They're reclaiming memory. Here's the part that hits hardest. All over the world, stories like the Menahooni are fading. Not because they're false, but because they're inconvenient. They don't fit into neat timelines. They suggest intelligence in places where colonial narratives claimed there was none. And they challenge the idea that history only began when it was written down. Because oral tradition is a kind of memory, and memory is sacred. The Menahooni teach us that being forgotten is worse than being feared, and that the truest magic is being seen. So, where are they now? Are the Menahooni real? There's no body, no DNA, no artifact that would satisfy Western academia. But maybe that's the point. If the Menahooni exist only in memory, then preserving their story is an act of resistance, a way of keeping indigenous knowledge alive, a way of honoring the people who came before and were forced into the forest when no one made room for them. But if they exist in the physical world, still building, still hiding, still watching, then everything we think we know about Hawaiian history changes. And suddenly, the question isn't whether they're real. The question is, are you ready to see them? Because they don't show up on camera, they don't do interviews, and they don't wait for permission. They've been here longer than we have. And if the stories are true, they always will be. I'm Devin, and thanks for joining me, Porch Pals. For more stories like this, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and help me reach 1,000 subscribers. And remember, there's always room for one more on the porch.